Senator Madigan.
Thank you, Mr Acting Deputy President. I rise today to speak on the ABCC bills. I strongly oppose this legislation and will be voting against it. I admire my crossbench colleagues for attempting to negotiate with the government. Of course we should be tackling corruption and misconduct. We should be doing everything we can to clean up all facets of our society. This includes our legal system, our commercial sector and the political sphere. Corruption is not unique to the building industry, and if the government was fair dinkum, it would be looking to tackle corruption across the board. The ABC's unique focus on the building sector and the draconian nature of its coercive powers render it inconsistent with fundamental democratic principles. This includes equality before the law, the presumption of innocence and the right to silence. The Parliament should be reluctant to pass legislation that offends these principles. The ABCC legislation provides inspectors with powers that are arguably greater than those possessed by ASIO and other intelligence organisations. These powers allow the ABCC to force anyone to provide information, produce documents or answer questions. If you don't comply, you face criminal prosecution and 6 months' prison. Say I was a young apprentice who witnessed a fatal workplace incident due to faulty machinery. I contact representatives from my union to voice my concerns, and a meeting is scheduled to discuss those concerns. The ABCC hear about the meeting and to decide to investigate what occurred at that meeting. Under the proposed laws, the ABCC can come to my home at 9 p.m. without a warrant, bring whoever they like with them, enter my home where my young children might be sleeping, search whatever they like, interview whoever they like and take whatever they want. If I don't oblige, I face 6 months in the slammer, or they can fine me up to $36,000 if they deem my meeting illegal. Now, I've done nothing wrong. I wanted to raise concerns about that fatal accident with the intention of preventing it from occurring again. That does not matter to the ABCC. I do not have a right to silence. I do not have a right to privacy in my own home. I'm not afforded the right against self-incrimination. My basic human rights are taken from me just for voicing my concerns over a life-threatening issue. I have fewer rights than an alleged murderer. Not even the police hold these powers. If coercive powers of the type proposed are genuinely needed, which I seriously question, they should apply to all people in all industries. On February the 24th, the Senate passed a motion moved by Senator Wang and myself resolving to hold an inquiry into the establishment of a federal corruption body to be known as the National Integrity Commission. The inquiry will consider the adequacy of Australia's existing legislative, institutional and policy framework in addressing corruption and misconduct wherever it is occurring. It will also consider the nature and the extent of coercive powers possessed by various statutory agencies, whether these are consistent with democratic principles and, if not, whether they are strictly necessary to each agency's ability to carry out its work. The Prime Minister has repeatedly rejected the idea of establishing a national corruption body. Attorney-General Senator Brandis went so far as to suggest that Australian federal politics is remarkably free of corruption when rejecting the need for such a body. Yet this is a government whose Cabinet Secretary, Arthur Sinodinos, remains in the New South Wales ICAC over corruption allegations. Senator Sinodinos was also recently found by the Australian Electoral Commission to have been involved in a scheme to channel and disguise illegal donations to the New South Wales Liberal Party prior to the 2011 state election. Astonishingly, he retains the confidence of the Prime Minister. Until recently, the government had also had the Honourable Member for Fisher, Mal Brough, as its Special Minister of State. Mr Brough remains under investigation by the AFP over his role in the James Ashby affair. In November last year, the AFP raided his home as part of its investigation. At the time, the Prime Minister publicly expressed his confidence in his then minister, despite the police investigation and raid. Mr Brough has since resigned. As for the Attorney-General, he is personally subject to allegations of perpetuating a cover-up in relation to the illegal bugging of the East Timorese cabinet by the Australian intelligence operatives in 2004. It has also been suggested that a 2015 job offer he made to Human Rights Commissioner Gillian Triggs in the weeks prior to the Commission's release of a damning report into children in detention constituted an unlawful inducement, although the AFP ultimately decided not to investigate the matter. So when the government says there is no need for a federal corruption body, well, they would say that, wouldn't they? There is plenty of evidence of corruption and misconduct in the building industry, and some of it is serious. However, there are allegations of high-level corruption in numerous sectors of society, including politics. I've just outlined some examples most of you are familiar with. There is also mounting evidence of widespread and potentially systemic corruption within the banking and finance sector. Yet when called on to hold a Royal Commission into the banks, the Prime Minister politely declined. In doing so, he firmly nailed his colours to the mast. Every effort needs to be made to stamp out corruption and misconduct in the building industry and wherever else it is occurring. However, this should not be at the expense of core democratic values. Any proposal to legislate in a manner inconsistent with these values must demonstrate a compelling reason for doing so. The government has not even come close to meeting this standard in the present case. Its case for bringing back the ABCC relies on an assumption that the building industry, which is a key driver of the Australian economy, is uniquely prone to corruption and misconduct. On that point, I say that the government has tirelessly reiterated that fact, that there are over 100 union officials facing over 1,000 criminal charges. I say quite simply that these figures reflect the effectiveness of our criminal laws and the current law enforcers. The law is doing its job in prosecuting those alleged to have done wrong. Why then and how is the government justifying the re-establishment of this draconian body, giving this body some of the greatest powers in the country, will in itself lead to corruption and bullying? A number of studies have considered whether the previous manifestation of the ABCC brought about productivity gains. There is no compelling evidence to support this claim. On the other side of the argument, the union says that reintroducing the ABCC will compromise workplace safety. There is evidence that workplace injuries and deaths actually increased when the ABCC was last in operation. As a general rule, weaker unions mean less safe workplaces. In the construction industry, where the risk of workplace injuries and death is a very real one, this issue cannot be ignored. I met with 3 courageous family members this morning who had all lost their loved ones as a result of workplace accidents. Kate Canizarati lost her 21-year-old son Ben, who was killed on a worksite in the ACT after a 39-metre boom from a concrete pouring machine collapsed and struck him. Kay spoke of the immense assistance she was provided by the union after Ben's tragic death. They were on the end of the phone and still are almost 4 years later to hear Kay's concerns. There was also Michael Garrels, who lost his 20-year-old son Jason when he was electrocuted while moving a power board on a construction site in Queensland. Michael spoke of the possibility of his son still being alive today if there had been union presence on that work site. And finally, there was Andrea Madeley, who lost her son Daniel when he was torn apart in a workshop after his dust coat became stuck in a horizontal boring machine. Andrea also spoke at the possibility of having her son Daniel alive today if there had been greater union presence at Daniel's workplace. We are moving past what really matters here. The health and safety concerns of our workers, the issues that Kay, Michael and Andrea have all had to deal with should not be swept under the carpet or suffocated by the return of the ABCC. All that said, I doubt there is a single senator in this chamber who believes the Prime Minister recalled the Parliament with the genuine intent of passing the ABCC bills. This has always been a nakedly political play. The government's aim is to give it the trigger it needs for a double dissolution election, clearing the Senate while setting up a campaign narrative centred on industrial relations. An election won on these terms would bring with it the passage of the ABCC and registered organisation bills in a joint sitting of the new parliament. This would seriously weaken the union movement while giving the government a mandate for industrial relations reform. As to what this might entail, I refer to an interview the Minister gave to The Australian in October last year under the headline, "I'm not for turning," says Michaelia Cash. The Australian reported the Minister's, and I quote, "fundamental belief in legislating to curtail union power." Citing Margaret Thatcher as her inspiration, Minister Cash explained that the ABCC was just the first step in a far more ambitious program of industrial relations reform. This would ultimately include the abolition of Sunday penalty rates and reform of enterprise bargaining agreements, she told The Australian. The Minister's rhetoric in explaining the government's plans could have been taken straight from the work choices era. "We need greater flexibility to remain globally competitive," the Minister told The Australian. Flexibility, of course, is code for deregulation. What the Minister flagged here is the government's intention to make it easier for businesses to sack their staff or pay them less or make them work longer or less convenient hours. Like many in the Liberal Party, the Prime Minister and his Employment Minister are wedded to an ideology that prescribes giving free rein to big business, lowering taxes for the wealthy, stripping back government services and, wherever possible, making people pay for them. Deregulation of the labour market is a core aim of those who share this view of the world. The experience of recent decades show that while this approach has been good for the top end of town, for many Australians it's been devastating. It has transformed what was once a land of opportunity and a society divided between the haves and the have-nots. And since the 1980s, we've watched as the industrial heartlands of our cities have slowly died off, the victim of successive governments too ideologically blinkered to see the obvious benefit of maintaining what once was the engine room of our economy. And as a result, it's becoming increasingly difficult to find a secure, well-paid job, especially for those living outside inner-city Sydney or Melbourne. This has not only been detrimental to the living standards of the majority of Australians, it's been damaging to our national character. At its core is an every man for himself ideology that runs counter to our national ethos of egalitarianism and fairness. The government's attempt to reintroduce the ABCC is not simply a reflection of its desire to see a tough cop on the beat of the construction industry. It is the first salvo in an ideological crusade aimed at stripping Australians of their rights in the workplace. I oppose this attack on the rights of working Australians, and I will be voting against the bill, as I could never look the people that I worked with in my earlier life in the eye and vote for this. Thank you, Madam Acting Deputy President.